Today's lecture, we're going to look at a slice of a personal mythology, which I myself used in conquering alcoholism. This is by no means a one-size-fits-all solution. This is meant to be a template for you, an example of what a personal mythology might look like once you begin a spiritually co-created belief system constructed in your mind and then deploying it into daily life. I'd like to offer a trigger warning right in the beginning here. I am a failed suicide. I took a bunch of pills while I was living in a different city, working where a job had assigned me, and woke up on the floor with my nervous system and shut down the next day. And I draw from this failed suicide experience, and it manifests as a sort of fierce ferociousness, a fierceness that says, I would rather die than go back to the hellish dimension of the alcoholic self, living that hellscape of the alcoholic. So if you're on medication for any kind of emotional instability, if you're a traditionalist who feels that the recovery community works for you, or if you're a traditional organized religious believer who feels that organized church doctrine works for you, this presentation likely isn't for you. Here's a summary of what we'll be walking through today. The mission statement is to provide a spiritually co-created framework with which to dismantle and reconstruct the alcoholic self-shadow complex. Early on here, I'll note once again, I'm a non-theistic paradigm that I deploy means that this cosmological speculation referred to as God or interventionist deity in a different dimension of space-time is unknowable and therefore irrelevant. So anytime you hear me refer to the word spiritual, it is equivalent to psychical. And in doing this good work, we're going to be attempting to reorient our perception as the life of the mind being primary to the external reality, the loosening of the grip of literalism and material reality has on our perception of the cosmos and our place in it. We'll look at the idea of psychospiritual death and Renovatio, a very specific type of rebirth referenced by Carl Jung in his book, Four Archetypes, which we'll look at some references on. We'll look at it, a tool, a mindfulness game that I used that became a very powerful tool in conquering alcoholism. I called Meditations on the Multiverse, where we actually stop and imagine a parallel universe where we had gone out drinking the night before, or where we had walked to the bar when we didn't want to drink that night, and imagining and envisioning what that parallel universe looks like in that toxified, drunken state. We're going to be looking at the concept of active imagining, which is not fantasizing. It is a very specific type of reflection, which requires a great deal of practice and concentration in order for it to work. It was developed once again by the psychologist, mythologist Carl Jung, who I'll be referencing a lot. And then obviously the goal in the end is finding joy out of all this by transcending the consensus reality that seems to weigh down on us. Joseph Campbell defined a personal mythology as anything which supports you in a time of crisis. There is no rigid definition of what this looks like. There is no defined source from which you can draw fuel or psychical building materials to construct this way of viewing reality and its challenges and the things for our purposes today, which, quote, drive you to drink, unquote. But in my own personal mythology that we're going to be looking at, one of the foundational points is that there is no such thing as alcoholic recovery. No one recovers. And this is an experiential knowledge. Plenty of people in mainstream society will disagree with this. But in my experience, looking at people who attend AA meetings their entire lives, even if they haven't had a drink in a decade, people who continue to use the paradigm of someone who is damaged or sick and therefore in recovery perpetually didn't work for me. And so I had to develop a new game, a new mythology by which to live. And that is critical to the esoteric game of deconstructing what I'm calling the alcoholic self complex and rewriting that part of your consciousness. The new inner universe for the life of the mind, you're going to hear me reference this concept, can draw from anything that fuels your imagination, that perhaps makes you feel like a child again for a moment, or things that set your mind on fire that you want to learn more of or experience more of. So it's not just comparative religion and depth psychology, but music, literature, film, art, dancing, hiking, meditative acts of any kind are all potential sources of emotive psychospiritual knowledge that we can then begin to deploy in our mythology. Um, we live in a very exteriorized culture in America. So when someone references the inner child, I feel like a snap reaction to the inner child being childish, that adults should not in any way be acting or feeling childlike, which is differentiated from childish. So what I find backwards is that the mainstream society, recovery community, and psychologic community has this poorly designed societal solution to alcoholics' psychospiritual crisis, which is to be more adult, more serious, more obedient, and take on more responsibility consistent with societally approved consensus reality definitions of what qualifies as an adult. I'll give you an example here. In my hometown, there was a baseball team that had made the World Series, and they were in the playoffs or something. Obviously, I don't follow sports. I'm not exactly sure what all the excitement was about. But the entire city was very excited, and you couldn't get into a ride share or stand in line at a grocery store without someone turning around and asking you if you'd seen the last game, what you think about the team's status. So eventually, I got curious as to the psychological root of this phenomena, and I started asking people, when did you first become interested in baseball? And this is people of every age, every demographic, every sex, every gender, um, um, and they all, without fail, gave some sort of reference to, oh, my family used to gather around the television and watch it together. Oh, my grandpa used to take me to baseball games when I was little. All of them, without fail, were referencing their first experiences with this sporting phenomena as children, because watching these games makes them feel like children again. But they're not self-aware enough, or individuated enough or self-actualized enough to recognize this and speak it authentically. There is also reference to this in esoteric traditions dating back thousands of years, including allegorical messages which were literally interpreted by the churches. My favorite of which is from Matthew 8:13, where the Christ says, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, 12 years of Catholic schooling I attended, and 18 years of Christian churching, and no priest, none preacher, or a good Christian could tell me what this sentence means. And the reason is because they're obviously interpreting the kingdom of heaven as a literal different dimension of space-time where this interventionist deity transports our mind to after death. But if we read this allegorically, referencing a life of the mind, symbolically, then the kingdom of heaven is equivalent to the Buddha's nirvana. It is a place here on earth where we don't feel fear or desire temporarily, because if you're housed in physiological form, you're always going to feel fear and desire. And in this case, this makes sense, this sentence. And the Buddha referenced it as well in the Dhammapada when he said, the fool worries, thinking, I have children, I have wealth. Indeed, when their spirit is not their own, whence are children, whence is wealth? So, in seeking out, feeling like a child again, it is the root emotional signifier and experience that goes along with this search for transcendence. That I believe is the root, one of the potential roots, I should say, sorry, of the alcoholic compulsion. The search for transcendence over daily life, over consensus reality. And there's a shame in that as well, where mainstream people say, why isn't consensus reality, why isn't material reality enough for you? It was enough for me. I have a family. I have kids, started a family. I go to work. I do this and that. I go to family parties and baseball games and block party barbecues, and this is all good for me. But no matter what your socioeconomic paradigm, if you don't feel like you fit, well, we're only human. That's going to result in an inner malady that stretches and turns into this vast expanse of wasteland where you feel outside because you can't participate joyfully in what you see as this external reality you don't fit in. I'm going to quote Carl Jung here. The darkness which clings to, oh, I'm sorry. William James referenced this in the Varieties of Religious Experience. I won't read the whole quote. It was a little poorly worded because it linked into other sentences, so I put my own qualifiers and brackets there. But this idea wasn't new, is what I'm saying. William James thought of this as well. I'll read this Carl Jung quote from Four Archetypes. The darkness which clings to every personality is the door into the unconscious and gateway of dreams, which step into our nightly visions or, remaining invisible, take possession of our ego consciousness. And I put in brackets, manifested as alcohol compulsion. So if you've had alcohol problems and you've been on a bender, or even if you've been in that very common situation where you're saying just one more drink and we'll leave, and you just keep saying we'll have one more drink at the bar, and you pour one more drink and it turns into 10 more drinks. That is a taking of possession of our ego consciousness. I ask you to ask yourself, who is in control? If I said I'm not going to drink on some random Wednesday night and I find myself walking to the liquor store or bar, who is in control? Psychology has a whole, the psychology industry has a whole realm of answers for you that reference brain chemistry and cognitive behavioral training and Pavlov training and this, that, and the other. Pavlovian conditioning, excuse me. But the question remains that there still has to be a part of you that has decided to overthrow the ego. The persona, the mask we wear that gets us through daily life is overridden. The ego that says, I'm going to stay home tonight, this is the part of me that's supposed to be the driver of the bus, is overthrown. And the notion that there is something there hidden that is operating on us that we need to access is what brings us to our next point here on Jungian active imagining. Carl Jung was the originator of the idea. However, he even referenced wisdom traditions and even alchemical. The original alchemists were thought to be the first psychologists, and the alchemical process, before it was corrupted by the notion of turning lead into gold, literally by the mainstream of their time, ironically, took things too literally, whereas their work was a work of wisdom and inner work to focus on transformation, transmutation. So if you'll allow me here, I'll read from a passage from Alchemical Active Imagining by Marie-Louise von Franz. We generally think of active imagination as talking to our own personified complexes and trying in our imagination and fantasies to personify certain of our complexes and then have it out with them, allowing ego complexes or the ego to talk to these inner factors. Now, this is not closing your eyes and fantasizing about a conversation, because that will simply be a superimposition, a superimposed ego point of view. So if there is some character being clever, that is not a trickster archetype. That is your ego plugging words into someone. This idea of setting the stage with this meditation, with this reflection, and then eventually giving voice to these different characters, personifications, the way they're standing, what they're wearing. Are they characters from film or literature or mythology or your life? Are they even human? Are they animals? Are they alien? This takes time to develop, whereas eventually the behavior and voices and symbols which these things communicate to you will teach us about the unconscious, which houses this alcoholic self. I want to lastly read here for you from Carl Jung, one of the most encouraging sentences I've found in his body of work from two essays on analytical psychology. Continual conscious realization of unconscious fantasies, together with active participation in those fantastic events, this is all internal, has, as I have witnessed in a large number of cases, the effect firstly of extending the conscious horizon by the inclusion of numerous unconscious contents, secondly of gradually diminishing the dominant influence of the unconscious, and thirdly about bringing about a change of personality. That is just an incredibly encouraging sentence to hear this founder of depth psychology and this practicing psychologist to say, look, I've seen this stuff work. And for the purposes of battling alcoholism, we can reread this as, firstly, of extending the conscious horizon by inclusion of numerous unconscious factors that drive us to drink. Secondly, of gradually diminishing the dominant influence of those unconscious content that drive us to drink, and eventually bringing about that change in personality. But in order, if you've never done this before, it's very hard to find any examples online. Everyone wants to charge you for some sort of seminar or a day, a trip, or something that explains anything similar to this. So I'm going to give you an example of a stage that you can set repeatedly and come back to each night and practice populating, letting your unconscious mind auto-populate the setting. My setting is simply a campfire. And there's a dark forest on the right. Forests are usually always representational of the unconscious. And there's an ocean on the other side. The ocean also representational of the unconscious. And we're on a small beach. We, meaning all these things, are internal to my mind. So when I say we, and when I refer to these different archetypes, aspects of your personality, archetypes of the unconscious, aspects of the personality, excuse me, those are two different things. I'm not referring to anything outside of the cranium. Excuse me, I'm not referring to any forces outside on some astral plane or something like that. That might be your personal mythology, but that's not active imagining. I have found that there are always four seats around the campfire, and they are differently populated, and the characters change. They look different, they sound different. Sometimes they will be thematically the same. It's placed in the same seat. But that doesn't mean that there will only be four for you. You can have a dozen in your setting, but it starts to get very busy, and it's difficult to track the communications and in my mind and the conversation. So four, I have found, ironically, relates to this idea of Carl Jung's quaternity, which means he thought he observed quaternities which occurred in nature, and that we had a quaternity, a natural disposition to the structure of four in our minds. So quaternities in nature are north, south, east, west is a natural quaternity. Water, air, earth, fire is a natural quaternity. But in this case, we'll use these four Jungian archetypes. The first is the ego. This is the one which drives the bus. For me, for our purposes today, this is the one who always speaks first for me. The ego, or the persona, which is Greek for mask, it is the mask we wear. Might be Latin for mask now, I can't remember. Through our daily lives. The masks are the roles we play. That is not necessarily ourself. Those are splinter portions of our personality, of our self, rather. Ego consciousness, though, is the one that drives the bus on daily life. So ego speaks first and says, look, I don't want to drink. We have an alcohol problem. And the animus, are the psychical, masculine or feminine opposite to your physiological self, or however you identify. And then there's the wise old self version that I use as the person who I want to be in 10 years or 20 years, psychically, not physiologically. And they weigh in, and the anima weighs in with their different perspectives. And eventually we get to the shadow. If you are housed in physiological form, you have a shadow. In my case, when I first started doing this many years ago, the alcoholic self took the form of this sub-personality, called itself heavy. It only referred to itself as heavy, and it was hungover and overweight and slovenly and slouched and negative, and everything it said sounded like clinical depression or existential fatalism, or looking at reality as having no meaning, having no purpose. And the older, wise old version of myself would say, well, that's because we haven't assigned a meaning yet. The anima might weigh in with compassion and say, well, look, this is a part of us. We can't deny the alcoholic self. We have to transmute it. And one of the archetypes that I ran into in transforming the alcoholic self as the shadow was the trickster archetype. I'll just leave you with one word on this, and that should be enough for active imagining. The trickster archetype is shadow material for me, in my experience. In my experience, it is not clever. It is not happiness because it is approved of. It is resistance to society. It is the dark humor. It is the bad joke. It is the thing that laughs in church. It is the thing that makes a joke at a funeral. It is the part of us that will not submit to fear, but also is very problematic when it comes to playing well with others and the societal roles that we're asked to play. So I hope I didn't overstate that, but if you get that conversation going, the idea here is to give voice to the shadow element, the alcoholic self, and begin to understand what in our unconscious mind we are craving when we crave alcohol. Okay, this is an example of a vision I had where if you do enough active imagining under this personal mythology, remember, this is all just a template for you, you can, as I have done, begin to develop the skill of identifying representations in empirical reality. That is to say, symbols in consensus and empirical reality. Sometimes they come as synchronicity. It's my favorite version. It's almost the reward of the esoteric path is to start identifying synchronicity, as opposed to delusions of reference where you think things are meaningful. Someone is speaking to you or something like that, or things are meaningful as assigned by a source outside of your mind. The idea of synchronicity or envisioning things in daily reality is that they are meaningful to us in our minds. And these symbols are all around us because we project our reality outwards. It doesn't mean that I really came across a gateway to a portal to a hellish dimension at this bus stop. That was a long disclaimer because this is often misunderstood. This bus stop is a few blocks from my apartment, and it is on the way to what used to be my favorite local bar to drink at happy hour. So one day I passed this bus stop. There's a man being led out of the bus stop into an ambulance, and he's clearly homeless, indigent, homeless, alcoholic. The ambulance drivers lifted him up out of the bus stop, and his pants were covered in, encrusted in feces and urine. So I watched them actually cut those part of his pants away. I mean, in a matter of seconds, I'm standing there kind of slowing and watching this as they lead him into the ambulance, and his hair is all wily and overgrown, and his clothes are all greasy and covered in feces. And it shook me, obviously, this vision of what alcohol can, the low state of animalism that it can bring us to. But I continued on to the bar that day and drank anyway. A few days later, in the same week, I came across this gentleman now you're seeing here in this picture in the same bus stop. And this is when my imagination first poked out its head and said, geez, this bus stop's like a portal to hell, this bus stop. Something dark about this bus stop. I get a real creepy feeling about this bus stop. Well, this gentleman had a line of drool from his mouth to his pants, indicating a heroin or an opiate overdose. And there was no ambulance here. And I looked around and didn't see one coming. So I'm actually the one who called the ambulance for this guy you see seated there. And guess what? After I saw the ambulance pull up, I went on to drink at my happy hour anyway. So the same week, I'm walking to happy hour for a third time, and I'm just dreading who I will see in the bus stop, and was relieved that there was no physiological person in the bus stop. Then I had a vision. Now this is not a hallucination. A vision is a self-aware projection superimposed on empirical reality. By my definition, a hallucination or a shadow projection are distortions of perception. But what I saw, quote unquote, and felt with every fiber of my being was a man from a parallel dimension in that bus stop that was dying of alcoholism, covered in feces, homeless, without hope, brought down to an animal state. And the ambulance, an imaginary ambulance, pulled up. And as they were lifting this man up, I saw utterly clearly that it was me, a different version of me that existed right now in a different dimension of space-time in the multiverse, where I was this lowly creature. And that day, after I beheld that vision, I stopped in my tracks and turned around and did not go to happy hour. So that after that experience, I conceived the meditations on the multiverse, which is the very simple but incredibly difficult daily practice. It's a mindfulness game of imagining. Every time you get the urge to drink, imagine what it would be like in that parallel universe if you did. Or you wake up feeling good, imagine what it would be like had you drank the night before. And what I would end up doing is envisioning that ghostly apparition of myself walking around the condo, hungover, being miserable, while I, here in the good universe, in the universe I am creating, in the dimension I want to be in, I'm lively and full of energy and vital. And this meditations on the multiverse, man, I'm telling you, the first couple months, I would go right up to the edge, ready to order a glass of wine at a restaurant, or ready to try just one beer, or to give myself one day, one reprieve, and then go back to not drinking. But I thought to myself, if you have a single drink, you will thrust yourself out of this new universe you were building, and you will never know how this ends. You will never know the experience of this universe. Don't do it. Don't thrust yourself out of the good dimension and into the ghostly dimension of alcoholism, where I referred to that version of myself as a preta loca, a hungry ghost. I forget what language that's from. All right, another tool that I used here are this paradigm of the seven deadly so-called sins in the Christian tradition. What I found was that they are actually a wonderful cartography to our genetically programmed human animal nature. And they are an extrapolation of the Buddha's fear and desire. But these things are so on the nose, I've called them the seven deadly obstacles to joy. And they are so specifically observable to me once I started seeing them everywhere in my behavior, monitoring them for them in my thoughts, that they became a tracking mechanism for waves of the things that would drive me to drink. And so another observation I'd like you to make is start watching advertisements on social media or commercial television. Watch them closely for any element of these 7 things, because in my experience, every single advertisement hits on one of these drives in us. And it's interesting that we in America sort of forgive and accept these drives as a materialist society whose goals are based in consumption and reproduction. These are just extrapolations of our most basic animalistic, genetically programmed behaviors. That's all these things are. And why is that bad? Well, it's not bad. It's not something to be ashamed of, but we're talking about transcending that which drives us to drink. So these I found very useful to monitor. Okay. The idea, if you recall back at the beginning when I said it is my personal mythology that no alcoholic ever recovers. We must destroy who we are, deconstruct, dismantle, and rebuild anew. That is not an entirely pleasant process. I'm going to warn you now that rebirth, death, psychospiritual death and rebirth is a painful process, and it is not something you just do and get over with. It's something that could last a long, long time in temporal reality. But I'm going to quote from Carl Jung in Four Archetypes, which is where the idea first fueled my imagination. Rebirth may be a renewal without any change of being, inasmuch as the personality, which is renewed, is not changed in its essential nature, but only its functions or parts of the personality are subjected to healing, strengthening, or improvement. I feel like that approximates what most people attempt to do in traditional paradigms of recovery. This next sentence actually applied to my experience. Another aspect of this fourth form of rebirth is essential transformation. Here, the renewal implies a change of one's essential nature and may be called a transmutation. This is where I actually realized that the persona, the name on my driver's license, my birth name, even my earth family, were all parts of me that were no longer really who I was. And I even gave myself a new name, Abhaya Porta, in the spirit of the gentleman who was a psychologist in America in the 60s and then flew to India and took on the name Ram Das. This is a psychospiritual name. It's also a pen name. But that renaming, I realized through my own experience, I realized why wisdom traditions and mystical traditions and of different transcendental traditions of different kinds do this practice, because you are no longer the name you're identifying with. You are no longer part of that earth family. You are no longer the person who shows up to the job. You may continue to go through the motions of those things, but as we detach from those things, we detach from the things that drive us to drink. Right. Here's another item that I differ with in mainstream recovery, and they talk about triggers, avoiding triggers. Hey, I understand this, maybe even for the first month or two. But in my experience, all of life is a trigger, okay? In consensus reality, that which drives us to drink, well, that's the thing I want to conquer so that I can say, I am not an alcoholic in recovery. I am a conqueror. I conquered alcoholism. I continue to walk the righteous path, but I no longer have to avoid triggers. What happens, let's say family. For me, family was a trigger. And to this day, before I meet with my earth family, I have to meditate before and then again afterwards. It's a very unpleasant experience. It's a very draining experience because people superimpose their reality on me, who they want me to be. And believe it or not, your family superimposes who they need you to be on you. They don't do this on purpose. There's no malice in this, but they're just human too. And so if you start showing up acting differently and referring to yourself differently, and you're not socially obligated to these roles, these duties that are heaped upon us, it shakes people up, it disorients them. So I chose this image here from this story. It was the third story of the Star Wars saga. And it links up with this notion from Joseph Campbell that the cave you fear to enter is where the treasure lies. Well, in this particular version, the young knight goes into the cave, a symbol of the unconscious. He confronts the shadow, which he thinks is a villain in external reality. And he fights it, and he cuts off the shadow's head. And what happens? The mask, the persona of the villain falls away, and the young knight sees himself, because it is one of the highest, most difficult esoteric principles to apprehend. There are no enemies in external reality. There are opponents. Oh, believe me, you turn on the television or just walk out the door, or, competitors at work, or a bad boss, or family members that are heavy on you. Oh, they are opponents to your joy. But the only true enemy is in your mind. It is the shadow. It is our perception of the threat that drives us to drink. All right, we're coming to a close here, and I have to weigh in on this because I gave a whole lecture exploring the unconscious mind with light psychedelics, meaning marijuana. I think that the psychologic community, the religious community, all superimpose their preferences on us and thereby impose their reality on us. And people's preferences is towards booze. We're boozers living in a boozing culture. So the very priests and preachers, the recovery psychologists, the addiction counselors that tell us not to use marijuana, all are okay with having a glass of wine at their church service or when they go home for dinner. The fact here is that marijuana does not obliviate consciousness. Okay, it brings us down spectrum towards the unconscious, and there's a lot in that statement, I understand. The point here is that it does not offer relief. And I'm going to give you an example. When I was drinking, I'd have a boss would micromanage me. I'd throw back, a 12 pack, and I'd go in the mirror and I'd start talking, fervently. I'd telling off that boss in my imagination. Alcohol is a demystifier. It brings us down to the ground. We don't transcend anything. We are numbed out. Consciousness is obliviated. By contrast, if you smoke just a little weed, within 2 minutes, you're in front of that mirror going, oh man, that guy wasn't, or that boss wasn't micromanaging you. They're just human too. They're just concerned about X, Y, and Z. You're registering this wrong. Or we say to ourselves, oh, I shouldn't have sent that email, or I should have picked up the phone and called that person. Why does marijuana result in an emotionally intelligent evaluation of our fears and behaviors, and alcohol does not? Because it brings us down spectrum, away from our ego defenses. And the mainstream society doesn't find this relaxing. This is why I believe marijuana is illegal federally and in many states, and alcohol is not. But for people to say, and this is, I'm going to try and contain my own shadow projection. You can hear the anger in my voice. When people say smoking a little marijuana after work instead of drinking when you're an alcoholic is just trading one drug for another, that is the most idiotic thing I have ever heard. And I don't care if you have a PhD in psychology or you wear robes on weekends and tell people you're connected to God in your church. You are wrong. You are ferociously, entirely, incredibly out of your league unless you've lived the hellscape of being an alcoholic and seen the fruits of transmuting to the behavior of ingesting a little marijuana after work, with dinner, or after dinner. You will never understand what you're talking about. You can't compare these two things. This is equivalent to saying, well, swatting a fly is the same thing as clubbing baby seals to death. They're both murder. That's how ridiculous it sounds to me when I hear someone comparing using a little marijuana after work to the hell of alcoholism. Okay, sorry, I went a little over there. I'm going to just quickly mention here that I am trying to build a new community of for those of us that cannot get on board with these ideas from Alcoholics Anonymous, that we have to admit that we're powerless over alcohol and turn our lives over to this cosmological speculation referred to as God. I put a little bit of this on the non-theistic religion I've created called the Church of Buddhist Christian Mysticism, which is simply a framework for spiritual co-creation. But I'm calling it a church and a religion because I believe it should be protected by the U.S. Constitution. However, it is a non-theistic religion, and I'll let you do your homework on that concept. Thank you for listening. The idea here is the reconstructing of our perception of reality to develop a new inner universe of self, and I truly wish that for you. Post tenebras, Spiro Lucem.